Good afternoon, dual enrollment history students. First, I want to apologize that I wasn't able to be here today. I had to make a last-minute appointment for my daughter Monday evening. You will be expected to listen to this lecture for the second half of Chapter 9 and take Cornell notes. At the end of this lecture, please complete a summary of the entirety of Chapter 9. We will begin Chapter 10 on Friday, and we will do the entire chapter on Friday of Chapter 10. There's only about 30-some pages that you have to read for it, and there will be a quiz on Chapters 9 and 10 next week. I believe on Wednesday is the day that we'll be meeting next week. And I will post the topics for the quiz this afternoon. So, as a member of the Mercantile Society in Great Britain, the American colonies were actually forbidden to develop manufacturing facilities. Their whole idea was for them to provide raw materials to Britain, the mother country, before the Revolution. So there was no need for any industrial base in the New World. So, however, when the American Revolution ended, the United States was way behind the curve for industrialization because the only thing that they provided was raw materials. So while the West and South were growing rapidly in agriculture, and we talked about it with the cotton gin, railways, the reapers, the harvesters, and so forth, they were growing very, very rapidly, and these technologies also helped the North begin their start into the industrialization and again into the Industrial Revolution. So things like steam power and as well as transportation and things of that nature gave the impetus for the factory system. So earlier, Britain was ahead of the textile factory system in which they made textiles, and they were very private about their ideas and how they did their factory system. So it started about 1705 when the steam engine came to pass, and Watts made some improvements on that steam engine in 1765, and they didn't really let that information get out. However, in 1789, a man named Slater came to America, and all the plans were in his head for this new water-powered spinning machine, and that was the beginning of what we know of the Lowell system. So the growth of the textiles in America was actually slow until Jefferson's embargo in 1807, and that gave the impetus to move forward because now getting textiles from Britain was very difficult because of the embargo, because no American ships could go to foreign ports to get textiles at that time. So, because of this gave rise to the Lowell system, which began in about 1813. And these mills were very significant because they housed both the spinning and the weaving all under one roof. And all of it was powered by a nearby river. So all these factories were built near a river. It was very different from British mills, who were usually in cramped cities, not by a river, as well as that the American system was in the countryside, and it was supposedly a family system with caring supervisors. The workers were usually women because they were able to be very dexterous when they were using the weavers and the spinning machines, as well as they were willing to take lower wages. The whole idea was that the women were happy and healthy, and but in some cases they weren't, as we see more of the labor system develop during this time period. So the demand for water power because of these textiles definitely affected the environment. So new factories challenged the old rules of where private owners could not divert water for private purposes. However, these businesses were buying water rights and diverting the water and then buying off private citizens in order to get these water rights for their factories. So they were diverting the water that was supposed to be for domestic use and controlling it for commercial uses and they were building dams and canals to guide water to the factories, which really angered the farmers and fishermen. Not only did it anger some of the locals, it also changed the environment as well. So it changed vegetation, it changed dry land to wetland and vice versa. The wildlife changed, as well as many of the dams destroyed fish populations. So it had a great change in environment, as we even see today when we change things in the environment. So with also the growth of the factories, even though they were set in rural areas, the rural areas would then become huge cities because people were moving in. There were dormitories that were put there. So more people were being moved in, and industrialization was happening in the cities with a rapid growth. So they required a large number of workers. And so once that factory was established, the city would be built around it, and would become urban. And this is when we get the definition of urban, which was defined as any place with 8,000 people. So between 1790, there was about 3% of places that went from rural to urban population, and it grew to about 16% by 1860. So that's a pretty rapid growth. So as we see here, some of the cities that grew is New York was the biggest growth. It was the fastest growing city in the area. Pittsburgh grew due to the ironworks that was going on then that we talked about last class. And then Cincinnati grew because of the meat packing plants that were there. So the cities that are over here by the Great Lakes, they're not on the map. However, we have Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, and Milwaukee. All these grew right about here due to water transportation. With the growth of urban life, also grew different kinds of urban recreation. So prior to the industrialization, entertainment was in the colonial period, it was basically a home entertainment. People attended balls in other people's homes. In winter, they went on sleigh rides. They went on picnics. And then they played parlor games such as billiards, cards, chess. And that was all done at home. Now people are going out for their entertainment. So this is where we see boxing becoming very popular during the 1830s, as well as animal prize fighting like cockfighting and dogfighting as well. Because people are now going out, we see a rise in taverns and saloons. So they spring up, and then also we see more social drinking outside of the home. During this time period, performing arts was becoming popular, and it was a primary outlet for American entertainment, minus what we just talked about. However, women didn't usually attend this type of entertainment because it was considered not within the woman's sphere. The woman's sphere was also considered still in the home, and that's where they should stay, and it was still majorly promoted by society. One part of performing arts that was becoming very popular during this time was the minstrel theater stories. And this was actually where actors would put on blackface and do very stereotypical African American stories at this time. So immigration, so between the Revolution and the War of 1812, there was actually very little immigration coming into the United States. So, however, there was a lot of turmoil in Europe during this time, during the first half of the 19th century, and this contributed to a major immigration to the United States from Europe. In 1845, there was a potato rot in Ireland, which resulted in the death of about 1 million Irish people. And also, many people departed Ireland because of the potato rot epidemic that was happening there. So by 1850, 43% of any of the foreign-born population were actually Irish. So almost 50% of foreign-born were from Ireland. So they would settle in cities, and they would become the cheap, non-skilled laborers. The Germans were also immigrating over here, and they were usually more educated than their Irish counterparts. This is where we see doctors and lawyers come over. They tended to move to the interior of the United States, like more in the western areas, and they established themselves in communities with other Germans. Also during this time period, we see some British come over to the United States, and also Scandinavians. So by 1869, there was more than 70,000 Scandinavians in the United States. And also the Chinese were coming over mostly to California. And by 1860, we would see about 35,000 come to California. And we're going to see more of that pop up, especially when we're talking about the gold rush and the railroad system that was being built over on the west coast of the U.S. So with the influx of immigration, we also see a rise in nativism. And nativism, so because many of the new immigrants to the United States were Catholic, we have the Irish coming over that were Catholic. As you remember, about 43% are Irish. This would arouse the mostly Protestant American society to fear that their nation was going to be at risk for having to convert to Catholicism. So this wasn't really true, but it would create this whole surge of fear of stuff that is non-American and primarily Catholicism. So this ideology was organized into groups. One was called the Native American Association in 1837, and then later on in 1849, a stronger group was formed, and it became political, and it was actually called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, and it eventually formed a third party on political ballots, and they were pledging to not ever vote for anybody who is foreign-born or anybody who is Catholic. And anytime that they were asked about their political stance on anything, they would say, "I know nothing," because their whole stance was no foreign-born and no Catholics. So they became known as the Know Nothing Party. And so mostly what they were promoting is that the exclusion of anybody who was foreign, immigrating, and Catholics from any public office, and the naturalization period for any of the immigrants who were coming to the U.S. be extended from 5 years to 21 years. So in order to become a U.S. citizen, it would now take you 21 years. That didn't happen. They didn't pass that, but that was part of what their platform was. So because of the labor system, we see some early unions happen. So in order to help the cause of some working people, the labor organizations were created during this time period in the form of trade unions. So, and a few third political parties would be developed that aimed at representing the working class, but they found little support with voters, so they didn't really get far. So, and they soon disappeared. So groups of workers would then organize themselves under the Democrat Party and would then work within that system to get their demands met within the political arena. So we see more of a revival of unions after the financial crisis of 1837. Labor unions would begin to emerge again, and by the mid-19th century, workers began to place an increasing importance on being members of a union to ensure only members from their union would then be hired for any of the similar jobs that they were going for. Teaching was the fastest growing of the new professions during this time period, and often it was a stepping stone for younger men who wished to study law. Young attorneys and doctors had very little formal training, and in many instances there was no regulation, so there was no medical boards, so you could just set up camp and say, hey, I'm a doctor or a lawyer, and that was okay during that time period. So the Industrial Revolution spurred the development of a new profession, and that was of the engineer. So by the time of the Civil War, engineering had actually become one of the largest professions in the nation, and that was due to all the inventions that were happening during this time period, as well as the Industrial Revolution. Although this was a period of scientific and political improvement, the role of females in the U.S. had not changed much. Women were still considered the primary caregiver in the home. However, more women began to seek a career in the male-dominated professions, but it was still very limited at this time. And this is where we get to see more of Jacksonian inequality and that of self-made man. So it promoted the age of the common man, where the common man would come and be better, and you have people that started out very, very poor but became very successful. So even though this is happening, there's still an inequality politically as well. And we'll get into that when we talk about this in chapter 10. This is just the beginning of chapter 10. So this is the conclusion of your chapter 9 lecture. Please complete your Cornell summary for the chapter 9. Please make sure that you leave your Cornell notebook in class. I will be grading it on Thursday morning, and if it's not here, I'll consider that you didn't do it. If you wish to do your Cornell notes and submit it on Google Classroom, I will have something open for that, so you can do that, or you can just do it in your notebook. Notes for Chapter 9 Part 2 will be checked on Friday, as well as all of Chapter 10. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I'll be able to email you back. Thank you, and I will see you on Friday.